So let's start maybe with Mr. Nurick.
Herb.
Herb Nurick. So,
That's my name, Herb Nurick, and I came with the firm in 1967 after I graduated went to Navy and graduated law school.
okay.
I'm Dave Lehman. I came the following year, although Herb and I were in the same law school class. And I'm here because he called me in the spring of 1968 and suggested that I interview, and I did, and here we are.
One of the better things I did for the firm.
Very kind. It was good for me, that's for sure.
And so, and you both were with the firm. Herb, you were with the firm how long?
About 29 years.
Okay. And Dave, you just retired within the
Well, I
last-
retired 10 years ago in 2009, so that was, can't do the arithmetic, 42 years of active service.
Okay. And all, they've both been very involved in Bar Association
Very much
events too during that time frame. So
Now, back to your question.
back to my question about McNeese and Hollinger and Nurick at that time and how this all started.
Well, I remember, of course, I remember I lived my life with McNeese, Wallace, and Nurick. My father was one of the founding partners. Sterling McNeese was from Indiana County and came here. Very well-known person and just a good lawyer and a good public servant. And I never knew Mr. Hollinger. Apparently, he died before Mr. Wallace got here. And I remember Mr. Wallace came out of the Second World War, and then I think they needed someone in real estate or tax, and Dave Wallace came. And my father had been here, but yielded to Dave because he was older. That was typical of my father. So it became McNeese, Wallace, and Nurick, but it kind of flows very well. So that's how it got started, and then just added more and more and more. And now I understand you're up to about 130 lawyers with all your co-offices, et cetera. So that's a big difference from 3 to 130.
And Dave, maybe if you have some thoughts on.
Well, both McNeese and Wallace had died by the time I arrived at the firm in 1968, but Mr. Nurick was very much present and really the dominant figure in the leadership of the firm, as he was in the community and in the larger bar. He had just finished his year of service as president of the PBA. The firm, when I arrived, was entirely on the 8th floor of this building at 100 Pine Street. And I had the fortuity of being located next to Mr. Nurick's office. So he was almost a mythic figure in many senses because both of his stature and his personality and the kind of man he was. So when I think of the firm, my sense of its founding and origin really is focused more on him than the other two.
And Herb, your father almost wasn't a lawyer.
That's for sure. I mean, my father came from very poor financial circumstances, and a good bit of my family in the background got out of Russia, and half went to South Africa, and the other half came to America. And he worked in my grandmother's, his mother and his father's grocery store. And when he went to high school, a place called Harrisburg Tech back then, it's before William Penn, he was in the commercial course. And he was never meant to go to college, but he did so well in high school that Dr. Fager, who was president, who was the superintendent of schools, insisted, or he probably was the high school principal at the time, insisted my father go to college and convinced my grandparents that he ought to go to college even though he was in commercial, because he was able to get my father into Penn State on probation. He advocated for my father to go there, and so my father was never destined to be a lawyer, and I know my father worked his way through college as a dishwasher, and eventually he made it. He did very well in college. He was able to stay in college and eventually go to law school. And when he went to law school, he went to Dickinson, and he worked in the grocery store. My grandfather had died by then. He helped in the grocery store until he got out of law school, but that's absolutely right. He was never originally destined to become a lawyer. But I think that helped him in the way he treated people. He could understand people no matter, it didn't matter to him if you were a member of the Supreme Court or I don't want to just say anybody else, but that's pretty good, Supreme Court, or someone else walking on the street, he treated you the same. So it was a very humbling experience, but one that was valuable.
He had a remarkable rapport with people across the board. And within the firm, his gift was to remember staff and lawyers. He knew who your children were, he knew who your spouse was. I mean, that was a gift of one of his many gifts, but I think it made him extremely effective in sort of his ability to talk to people, to relate to people, but also to be respected as an authority figure in the organization and outside.
In one of the stories at McNeese, I think we have this clients first mantra that meeting our clients' needs is so important. And it seems like that really grew from the beginnings with both Sterling McNeese and with Gilbert Nurick. Can you guys comment on that?
Well, clients were always first. You give the best service you can to clients, but it was always mixed. The firm was always known as being good to the community, the professional community, Dauphin County Bar Association, Pennsylvania Bar Association. We had presidents in both. And to the community in general, I remember, actually my father was a member of what was then called the Colored YMCA, because one of his good friends was the executive director there. And we had presidents of the YMCA, and in the general community, just well known. So that was what the firm represented: good service to clients, but don't forget the community. Would you say that's?
Absolutely. There was a specific overt emphasis on community service, which touched community organizations, civic organizations, charitable, church, and religious organizations. And I think the firm had an outsized role in the community for that very reason, that its lawyers, without a whole lot of ceremony, served in many capacities in many places and had a terrific influence. And I mean, just to take one, the United Way has been for many years benefited from the leadership of McNeese lawyers and the support of the organization and its people. And that continues today, and I'm very happy to see that. But that's just one example of strong leadership that the firm has shown. And it's been quiet, but I think purposeful and deliberate. I remember as a very young lawyer being encouraged by Sam Schreckingest at that time, who almost pounded the table and said, "You must join organizations, you have to become active in the community. What are you going to do?" It was that direct. So I joined the JCC, which was the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and you know, I got to know dozens of people, and it's true. The friendships, the connections you form through enterprises like that are personally rewarding, very satisfying. They're good for the community, but in the long run, they also serve the interests of the firm.
You know, another part of the firm was diversity, and we always tried to get diversity within the firm, both color, religious, and, you know.
Political.
Pardon me?
Political.
Well, not, I was thinking it's political so much, but, you know, sexual, you know, men and women. And we had a member of the firm, Randy Houston, I was mentioning before we started here, who was a young black fellow, great guy, and he talked about community service. Randy is now the president of the Penn State Alumni Association, the greatest alumni association in the country. So that sort of all ties in too, so I just wanted to bring that out.
To put too fine a point on it, but when Sterling McNeese hired Gilbert Nurick, it was unusual in the sense that he hired a person of the Jewish faith, which was unusual, at least in the Harrisburg community. And for many years, historically, we know this from the past, that the bar was very exclusionary, particularly against black lawyers, but they also were restrictive in admitting people to practice. And it was a slow and deliberate process to overcome over many years. And the firm has shown leadership in continuing that work. Frank Hawes, in particular, was a leader in the efforts. The bar formed, in the mid-'80s, formed a committee called the Equal Professional Opportunities Committee, whose purpose was to foster opportunities for minority lawyers in particular. And Frank had a leadership role in that. And the firm remained active in the various projects that that group undertook.
Picking up on that, Mr. McNeese wanted my father to know that he knew he was Jewish. And he said to me, not to me, when he was interviewing my father, I know my father told me, he said, now, Mr. Nurick, they called each other Mr., even though they were like father and son. It was always Mr. McNeese, Mr. Nurick. And Mr. McNeese said to my father, he said, now, Mr. Nurick, when are those holidays coming up for you so that I know when you not to expect you at the office? In other words, I know you're Jewish, but I'm going to hire you anyhow. And that was something else.
And David, you also played a very big role in the EPOC committee for the Bar Association and in the Capital Area Managing Partner program. Could you talk a little bit about that and about how the firm supported that over the years?
The year after I served as president of the Bar Association, I took on the chairmanship of that Equal Professional Opportunities Committee. And one of the projects that came along, and it was really suggested by our then executive director, Don Morgan, was that to make real progress in this area, it was important to get the larger firm organizations involved and engaged and committed because they really had the capacity to do hiring. Small firms, individual practitioners might hire a lawyer once in a blue moon, if ever. And so it was the law firms, if there was going to be active change, the law firms had to take the leadership role. And so the idea behind the Capital Area Managing Partners organization was to recruit the firms, asking each to make a specific commitment to increase diversity in the local bar. And it played itself out by establishing a summer hiring program where minority law students were recruited from, particularly from Pennsylvania law schools, invited to come to Harrisburg for the summer. They got a good stipend, an internship in one of the local law firms, and a series of introductions to the practice of law in central Pennsylvania and to life in central Pennsylvania for those who weren't familiar with it, to try to improve those opportunities, and had a good deal of success. We had a selfish motive also, which was a number of lawyers who came to McNeese came through that program, and it was also an opportunity for the firm to improve its standing on the diversity front.
And I think really the diversity thing goes back again to Gilbert Nurick and his role in PBA and the Dauphin County Bar Association. And one of the things we talk about around here is don't be a veto lawyer. And I wonder if you guys remember that phrase and,
Sure.
and some of those, the pearls of wisdom that really we've learned from Mr. Nurick originally and still, I think, try and continue.
Right, and he wrote a legal law article about that, Don't Be a Veto Lawyer, which was in the Dauphin County Bar Association Press or Pennsylvania Bar, I forget which, but it was published somewhere. And the idea was your clients don't want to hear why you can't do something. They want you to figure out a way how you can do something. And in other words, don't veto everything. You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. We'll figure out a way, if it's legal and ethical, how you can do this. And the epitome of this was when the Milton Hershey Trust Company, Milton Hershey Trust ran the school, the Milton Hershey School, had more money than it needed to run the school, and they wanted to divert some of that money to form a medical school for Penn State. And they had to do that. You had to do that through the courts. It was called a cypre. Use the money for something similar to what it was being used for. It was a pretty tough concept, going from money to run a school for orphan boys to run a medical center. Other lawyers had tried it and it didn't work. But the assignment was given to my father, and he was very close with Sam Hinkle, who was president of the Milton Hershey Trust. And they worked together, and they were able to to change $50 million from the trust to start Hershey Medical Center. And there's a very famous story about Sam Hinkle, who was president of Hershey Foods. Now it was Hershey Foods, back then it was Hershey Chocolate Company, and who was also president of the trust, and Eric Walker, who was then president of Penn State University. And this is a story that that people know. It's just a common story, but it's very interesting. Now, Sam Hinkle called Eric Walker on the phone and said, Eric, I think Penn State ought to have a medical school. And he said, Sam, we don't have any money to start a medical school. And Sam said to him, well, Eric, how about if you had $50 million? He said, whoa, wait a minute, $50 million? Yeah, that would be fine. But anyhow, there's a lot more to it, but they worked on this legal aspect of it and were able to change that money, divert that money from the trust to away from the school into the Hershey Medical Center. And that's how the Hershey Medical Center got formed. In fact, my father was now referred to as the legal architect of the medical center. So that went from serving the public, serving good service to lawyers, to your clients. Don't be a veto lawyer as part of that good service onto this $50 million transfer.
And I believe your father was also involved in the expansion of the school trusts to accept a broader variety of students.
Well, eventually, yeah, they accepted non-males. It was at first for just males. They eventually had females and a good number of black students. As a matter of fact, if you see a picture in the paper now of the Milton Hershey School, you'll see loads of blacks and loads of females. So yeah, it was a big change. David may know more about that, but that's what happened.
No, there were a series of amendments that came about that were done
To the trust.
appropriately to the trust document, which was drafted in the early part of the 20th century and had a lot of restrictions, which today would not be acceptable, and those were overcome by various procedures that were filed on behalf of the trust. I think through Mr. Nurick's work on certain engagements for Milton Hershey and the Hershey organizations, Hershey began to trust the firm with more and more legal work. And over the years, the relationship between the Hershey Chocolate Company and its affiliate organizations was a good one. It was.
I wonder if you could touch on some of the ways McNee's lawyers really have helped us get the beautiful downtown and the vibrant business community that we have these days.
It's a long story, and we probably shouldn't burden this with with all of it, but in briefest form, it started, I think, with a recognition by business leaders, Chamber of Commerce types, Ed First and Frank Hawes come to mind in particular, recognizing that the core of downtown Harrisburg had atrophied and really had become a distressed center city. And they understood that it would not be attractive. I think their long-term aspiration was to see Harrisburg become a larger metropolitan area, but that no suburban location would want to associate with the dying downtown. So the idea that there had to be downtown improvement was driven by business leaders. There was a change in the form of government, and I think Frank Hawes had a hand in that, changing the form of governance for this city. And led in the mid-'70s to the formation of an interesting, it was actually a three-part enterprise. The Harristown Development Corporation was essentially a private corporation with certain public attributes. It teamed up with the city and with the Harrisburg Redevelopment Authority. A very complex plan for the redevelopment of the central business district, which spanned from Walnut Street to Chestnut Street, from the river to Fifth Street. There was a declaration of blight. So it invoked the power of condemnation. And then a plan for how to redevelop that, which started with the construction of parking garages, the demolition of a whole block, and the creation of what's now the Strawberry Square and related businesses, a long-term lease, which generated a lot of money that enabled that all to take place. It was a complex, long-standing project that played itself out over many years, but was really probably culminated with the construction of the Hilton Hotel and Towers. And at that point, its dominance, I think, kind of stepped back a little bit. But it's a remarkable story that, if told in its full, would be interesting to anybody.
You know, mentioning Frank Hawes, we wanted to bring in the Dauphin County Bar Association as much as we can. And Frank Hawes was very active there, and he was a president at one time, but as were a number of the partners here, including David. But I think it was Frank Hawes who was responsible for buying the building where the Dauphin County Bar Association is now. And in fact, we had the kitchen turned into a restaurant for a while. And there just weren't enough people to patronize it, so that stopped. But it was because of Frank Hawes that we have the building that we do now. He was instrumental in that. And what David mentioned in general with Harristown, Ed First for a number of years was president of the Chamber of Commerce, and that was very helpful both to the chamber and to the firm.
I think it's no coincidence that the headquarters of the Dauphin County Bar Association is 1 block south of the building that we occupy. And the Pennsylvania Bar headquarters happens to be 1 block north of the building we occupy. And I think that it's not, the firm had some role in each of those organizations and still does.
Well, that's right, the firm, and I know my father was instrumental in getting a wing of this, where the Bar Association is now. It was called the Bailey Wing, purchased for to make a total Pennsylvania Bar Association building. So that's correct, that is more than, it's really coincidental, but very makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And Herb, you've been extremely involved in much more PBA and some Dauphin County Bar Association. Can you talk about what you've done on the Bar Association end through the years?
I hate to talk about myself.
You have to, sorry, that's what this is about.
Well, I was very active in both bars. I know as the Dauphin County Bar, I had just a funny story related to this. I was selected to run the dinners at first. We used to have dinners over at the wherever we held our, at the courthouse. We actually had
at the courthouse.
We actually had to have it before we bought the building at the courthouse, and I hired a caterer named Frank Zlogar, who was a pretty good caterer. But without being asked, Frank would get up and he'd give the prayer before the meeting, say, bow your heads. And no one asked him to do that, but that's what he did. But then I was very active in the Pennsylvania Bar and became a chairman of the Young Lawyers section. And then I became active became chairman of the mediation, the mediation, arbitration, alternative dispute resolution section of the Pennsylvania Bar. But Dave was just every bit as active, and but I did spend a lot of time dealing with both bar associations and trying to put various things ahead.
I think you're both champions of professionalism, too.
Absolutely.
And the role that it has in our lives and in making our working lives easier. Can you just touch a little bit on your views on really how a lawyer should act?
Yeah, I was chair of the professionalism committee for the Pennsylvania Bar Association, and we wrote a fellow named Joe Skelly, who's still around, not in Harrisburg though, the working rules for professionalism, and certain rules and introductory, and there's another lawyer in Philadelphia that was helpful in that project because we felt that lawyers, we're not supposed to be fighters, and we're supposed to be litigators, but not in the wrong sense. But you need to have professionalism in practice of law, and we worked hard on that. And I know Dave is always very professional and followed through on those.
Yeah, I think it's something you learn. It's not, you model other people. And probably, Gilbert Nurick personified professionalism in the sense of treating people with dignity. I mean, he could be firm, he could be stern when the occasion called for it, but it was never hostile or abusive or some of the things that can happen in tense situations where lawyers are involved in advocating and they lose sight of their role, which is to represent the client's interest, and it becomes personal or personalized and then extraordinarily unpleasant. So helping lawyers understand how to play that role, to stay in the role of the advocate, and to recognize that emotional overload isn't going to serve the interests of what you're trying to accomplish. It's a lesson you continually preach to younger lawyers, and hopefully some of it rubs off over time for them.
Fight the problem, not the person.
Ooh, that's good.
That's good. I think, and Herb, earlier you mentioned kind of the political diversity of the firm, and two cases and more people, examples come to mind. One being, I think, Arthur Berger's role with the ACLU and civil rights, and then also the case of the Harrisburg Seven. And I don't know if either of you can expand a little bit on those two relatively, could have been controversial at the time, certainly in the 60s and 70s.
Well, Arthur Berger and Tom Menaker also were not afraid to take on controversial issues and represent people that needed representation. The Harrisburg Seven, and when we had the riots in Harrisburg, Tom Menaker helped with representing the Black Panthers, which was a separate group back then. And they just felt it was the right thing to do, and I know Tom recruited me to help work on some of those issues. Arthur Berger was president of the ACLU. Yeah, and I think Tom eventually was too. So the firm, not everybody, but if you represent the firm, that's the firm, was not afraid to take on controversial issues and just make sure justice was done in the community.
Well, the firm within its membership had tremendous political diversity. We had some reactionary types, I mean, people whose conservative views would have been polar opposites of the ones that Herb was just describing. But this wasn't a politically driven firm in any sense, that we had to reconcile those. I mean, and people were able to acknowledge the differing opinions about matters in politics, but to be able to work collegially or collectively within the firm, and I think that was one of its strengths, was the ability generally to be seen as a non-political enterprise. In fact, I think the firm was very slow to ever come to the idea of, eventually there was a political action committee formed, but even then I think the firm has been pretty careful in trying to be seen as non-partisan.
Neutral.
Maybe turning to some more light topics.
I was just wanted to,
Oh.
the tradition of representing causes on a pro bono basis, a couple of points to make perhaps are, one of my early interests was, because I admired the lawyers who worked for the Legal Services Organization. I was active in the boards of both the local legal services enterprise and the statewide legal services organization. That's continued with people like Jim D'Angelo and others who have led the public service efforts of the local bar association, which really translates into providing legal services for people who by and large could not afford to hire them for themselves. And the other sort of representing interests on a pro bono basis, Frank Miles, who was an active litigation lawyer here for a number of years before he went off to work for a client, took on an ACLU case, and he represented, his client's name was Little Bird of the Snow. And it was a Native American person, and her tribe did not, or believed that graven images or photographs should not be taken, so it was either a license or a passport, which she wanted to have issued, or her parents wanted to have issued for her. The government wouldn't do it without a photograph on it, and the question was whether her religious beliefs could overcome this regulatory question. That actually went up to the Third Circuit. Frank Miles persuaded the government that indeed her rights should be respected, but anyway, it was an interesting pro bono case that was pursued.
All right, now I'm going to turn us to some light topics. The routing numbers and how we identify ourselves by your number.
Oh.
Herb is number 30.
31.
David's 30. I'm 172. So talk about the routing number system.
Well, I remember the routing numbers when I came, as I said about 3 times now, I was number 30. But eventually we had so many lawyers that we started using 100 for the administrative group. I'm sorry, 100 for the administrative group, and changed that 1 through 30 to a different group. So actually, they made 100. They made 30. Tom Harris was always the office manager, But when we started going into the 3 digit for the administrative group, they made him 100. Well, Ed First, who was a very stern person, wonderful person, great sense of humor, everything, but he was pretty strict. He wrote me a message one time, said 30, what about this paper? And it didn't make any sense to me at all. I thought, my gosh, this is really, I must really be out of it. I just don't understand anything about this thing. So I called him on the phone. I said, Ed, I hate to bother you. I said, he liked us to call him Ed. I said, I absolutely don't understand what you're asking me to do here or what it's about. It doesn't make any sense about anything I've been doing. I said, oh my gosh, that wasn't meant for you. That was meant for Tom Harris. They had just changed the 100 to, there were 30 to 100, and he sent me the 30 thinking it was still Tom Harris's number. So that's one funny thing I remember about the number. And on light subjects, I just want to get back to Mr. Bernice. His nephew is Jimmy Stewart, and they were very, very close. And Jimmy used to come up to the office to visit, and when he would, the lady members of the staff would like to come out and make sure they made their presence known when he was in the lobby. So I don't know if you have anything on the more on the numbers or.
No, it was a convenience for distributing internal material. So Mr. Nurick's number was 30, and you would often get a handwritten note, and it would just be, the convention was, when you were sending a memo to somebody, it would be 3, and it would be a line with a cross, and then to 31 with a dash behind it, which meant that's, and my guess is it had a military origin, that convention of using numbers for communication purposes was simpler than writing names. And it was a convenience, and I think still continues to serve, although the firm has gotten to a point where they're using 4-digit numbers, and I think it must be extraordinarily difficult to remember who is 2421, or to pick an example.
I'm sure you have a cheat sheet.
Yes, cheat sheets, so. You can talk a little bit, I mean, about the tradition of the dinner dance at McNeese. It's been going on as long as I can remember, but when, after the annual meeting, the big dinner dance.
Well, they always had a dinner dance. I mean, there weren't that many people, and it would be a tux affair. And at first, I think, I'm looking at my wife right now, I think Jane First used to organize those. And
Do you know when they started? I don't.
I can't remember when we didn't have them. And I remember one time Frank Haas wanted to go someplace, so he didn't. When he was in trade, he didn't want to make it too long. Too long. I remember that. But now they evolved into this huge, hundreds of people coming in.
Yeah, but the tradition has been here certainly since I arrived in 1968 of having a holiday party. It used to be on the day of the annual meeting. That may or may not still apply. On a Saturday night, an elaborate dinner followed by music, cocktails, dinner, and dancing afterwards. And it's a lovely occasion to get everybody together in a celebratory mood. It had been, I think, after the annual meeting in December, so it was in the Christmas holiday rush, and I think as a matter of convenience, it got moved to January just because scheduling was easier in that period of time. But certainly the tradition has continued.
It was always at the Hershey Hotel.
Yeah, and it started in smaller ballrooms and has expanded now until it must be one of the larger parties that Hershey throws in the course of a year. But everybody looks forward to it, at least I do. And the convention was for many years that the after dinner and before the dancing started, a skit would be presented by associates. And those, over the years, became works of art. I mean, we had comedy writers who could deliver satire that was as good as anything on television today. But over time, boundaries were pushed, and the firm got to a size where some of the jokes weren't understood because they were poking fun at one lawyer or another, and other people would say, "What's that about?" So the skit passed from the scene, but for many years it was a thing of beauty to behold.
They were funny.
Yeah.
And I think also some of the legends around McNeese are about the memos that used to be circulated, very witty things, including at one point a petition for reinstatement of the comma.
Yeah, that's.
What do you guys remember?
It occurred in a point, I think in the late 90s, as the the firm used its name, obviously, as a graphic on correspondence, on advertising and marketing materials, and McNeese, comma, Wallace, ampersand, Nurick, is a little clunky. I mean, nowadays, the logo is McNeese, and the idea is to try to make it more dominant, more eye-grabbing, et cetera. And at some point, I think during John Euler's administration as the managing partner, the sentiment was take the comma out so it flows more easily, and it's, that who needs punctuation kind of thing. And so in jest, an unknown author, when the new logo came out without the comma in it, some wag in the firm composed a document which looked like a court petition. It was captioned, "Before the Grammatical Hearing Board, it was in the matter of the comma versus the partnership." And it was a petition for reinstatement. So it was written like a legal document, but it was hilarious in that the comma recited its standing as long affiliation with the firm. It was its denial of equal protection or due process in the decision to eliminate it from the firm's representation, and it went on in that vein. But it was a source of hilarity around the office, because here you have all these straight-laced lawyers who are reading a satirical document that was really very well done. But that was just an example of things that lawyers in their lighter moments could create that lightened the atmosphere. And people took it with a good sense of humor, including John Euler, who said, "I give up, the comma will be reinstated." And it hung around for a while after that.
The practical jokes and hijinks, we'll call them.
There were legendary in many, but I'm not going to try to.
Not appropriate for for history books.
At the moment, they were, but they actually, I think they inspire collegiality and friendships, that people are able to sort of step out of their formal, strict legal selves and to poke fun at each other or at practices or institutions, and do it in a way that isn't destructive.
I'll bring up one other one. I was in the utility department, and Bob Griswold, who was chairman when I was there to start, had this huge calendar, the real big one you have. It has every day in big numbers and a lot of space. And he would put on there every case that every one of us had for that particular month, and then the next month, and the next month. And we would meet every week, and we'd go over the calendar. And it became a joke, the calendar. Well, Donna and I had a party for the, Donna, who's my wife, I might just add that. We had a party for the utility department one time, and I remember I asked Ed Reel, who at that time was an associate, I said, "Bring the calendar in your car, and then at a certain time go out and ring the doorbell and present the calendar." And of course, he did that, and we all got a big laugh out of there. It's this big social event, and here comes the calendar. But I don't think we missed any engagements on our professional activity. Okay.
It's before the days of electronic calendars, where we're all subject to paper.
Right.
And we all still challenge, it still struggles sometimes getting things on the calendar, so. The one question I wanted you guys to think about is what do you think is going to really be the lasting legacy and impact of McNeese on the community and on the legal profession? McNeese as a law firm on the community.
Now, I personally see McNeese as the epitome of professional lawyers, qualified lawyers, a firm that wants to do right by its clients, but also do right by the professional organizations that it serves, like the Dauphin County Bar Association, Pennsylvania Bar Association, and the public in general, as we mentioned before. It's an all-around firm. I'm very proud to be a member. I'm very proud to still be associated with it in my retirement. And I just see it as just a great firm that can set an example for any firm in the world.
I'll second everything he said. I think it's the firm's ability to endure as an institution, I think, is is a tribute to some of the
Correct.
strengths that were built into the firm at the outset, and the ability of successive generations to sort of acknowledge that history and kind of the core values that hold the place together. For most of my time in the firm, one of the controlling questions was, what's in the best interest of the firm in making management decisions about growth, about hiring, about direction the business or practices were to pursue, or how individual lawyers were to be treated. Sort of the operative issue was what's going to be in the long-term best interest of the firm as opposed to any particular individual's preferences or whims. And over the years, that wasn't always easy to figure out, and sometimes people could have differences of opinion, sometimes people left because they didn't like decisions that were made along the way. But the ability to sort of stay true to some central guiding principles, I think, has served the firm well and enabled it to be the kind of institution that hopefully can carry forward in the future. It's really dependent on the successive generations to continue to figure that out.
And I don't want to prolong this, but David made a very good point that I just want to emphasize. The firm tried very, very hard to keep the firm going as a firm, and you see the results. Other firms have disappeared, and McNeese, Wallace, and Nurick is still in full gear. It was a good point, Dave.
Guys, that's all I had. I don't know if you wanted to opine on anything else.
I want to thank you for doing the interview.
Well, you're welcome. It was
Thank
my
you for
pleasure
getting
to
30 and
do-
31 together.
for
Yeah.
getting 30 and 31 together, and I think it's always great to be able to talk about the institution we all love.